All right, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Nice to see those of you who are here synchronously with us. Hope everybody had a good weekend. Um, so we have now kind of wrapped up our section of the class about Karl Marx. Um, I'll just say on a personal note, I enjoyed it very much. I enjoyed the discussions that we had here, and I'm also enjoying the online conversations that we've had on perusal with the annotating of the text. Uh, Seems like most of you did really well on the quiz that was due today. So I think that this was a success. I think that, we were able to see kind of like how Marx is still relevant today. Go ahead, Paige.
I just have a quick question. So, for office hours, is it 11 to 12 or is it 4? Because it says on the syllabus 11, but then the Zoom thing says 4.
Oh yeah, it's at 11. It's because I've had this ongoing issue where somebody else's the Canvas class was previously occupied by a different professor who set up different kinds of things. And I'm able to erase most of them, but the office hours thing I've not been able to erase.
Okay, so I did join in there, but then I left when I seen that it said 4. So, would you have maybe like a few minutes to chat after class?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, let's talk after class. Um, don't let me hang up on you. Uh, Pretty sure I won't, but
No worries, I'll remind you. Thank
okay,
you.
cool. Thank you. You just remind me in the chat or something like that. Okay. Yeah, so I'm looking forward now to launching into 3 weeks of Emile Durkheim, who we'll see is a very different kind of thinker than Marx. They share some overlap, just to some extent, for sure. But in many ways, they're very different. Durkheim is, not the fire-breathing revolutionary that Marx was. He was, somebody who was taught at the best university in France and was really concerned to try to make sociology into a legitimate science. Um, he was not necessarily trying to change the world in the way that Marx was. He certainly thought that, like, a science of sociology could help make the world better, that it could be an instrument of social reform and social improvement. But he isn't, like with Marx, where, he's hoping that his ideas and words will spark some sort of a social revolution. Durkheim was not a revolutionary. But we will see that he has some very interesting things to say. Overall, generally speaking, I kind of prefer Marx and align myself more with Marx's ideas. But I do find Durkheim to be very challenging and compelling, and somebody whose ideas are worth wrestling with, and who does cover some sorts of questions more fully than Marx did. In particular, we'll see that Durkheim has a lot to say about religion. And I think that that's a sort of a core component of his thought that although Marx does dwell on religion and look at religion, um, he doesn't. I think he kind of gives it a little short shrift, and Durkheim does a sort of a deeper dive into like what is the function of religion in society. So that's sort of what we're looking forward to in the next few weeks. Um, I had today an exercise, another assignment that I was going to have due next Monday. it would have been similar to what you did with Marx, where you watched a film and then did a forum post about it and that sort of thing. But I sort of decided that that was kind of redundant um, relative to these perusal reading assignments that you would have done. It would have basically trod over the same material with organic and mechanical forms of solidarity. And so I can't basically I'm going to cancel that assignment. It would have been exercise number 3. What I'll do is I'll just give you all the points without you having to do anything, so that it's covered in the grade book. Yeah, I just thought that that would be uh, an assignment that now would have been redundant because you're already going to be wrestling with Durkheim's writings in your regular perusal assignment, your regularly weekly perusal assignment. So the regular weekly perusal assignment is still happening. It's just that I had intended originally to pair that with another exercise, which I'm now canceling. Hope that's clear and doesn't create more confusion. Um, any questions before we get started? Okay, I'm gonna go to my screen share. As always, feel free to chime in, questions or comments if the spirit moves you. Just opening this up. Okay. There's Emile Durkheim and his awesome mustache. Where'd he go? Oh, there he is. You can see just by the dates of his life that he comes after Marx. You know, remember he's about 40 years younger than Marx. So he comes along at a different sort of time in world history. Um, and it starts with this good quote from a book that we'll be reading, like I think in not we won't be talking about it this week. We'll be talking about it next week and maybe the week after. From the book that's called The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. And I would say this is my favorite book from Durkheim, where he does this kind of cross-cultural study of religion and with the role that religion plays in social life. And this quote here is a really good kind of example of his Durkheim's main overall concerns. Above all, he's concerned with how societies can achieve and maintain unity. The word that he uses to describe this is solidarity. You know, you may think of solidarity as sort of the principle that an injury to one is an injury to all. The idea that we all have a kind of a unity or a sense of responsibility to, you know, stand up for each other and to help each other. He believes that this is the sort of the fabric of social life, this sense of solidarity that we have with people in a group, and a sense of responsibility and unity with them. And he believes that in terms of religion, that rituals like ceremonies and social gatherings are really crucial for this kind of togetherness. All religions have some degree of ritual, some ritualistic kind of events that affirm social bonds, that create this kind of togetherness, in which people are gathered together at a certain place and time, um, and that they kind of like reaffirm, they strengthen those social bonds. Here, Durkheim calls them common sentiments, or what he will call the collective consciousness or a collective conscience, basically to designate what he says are a group of people with like-minded beliefs. And so religion has been traditionally, historically, and in all kinds of different parts of the world and all kinds of different religions, religion has been the main source of these kinds of rituals that bring people together and express their common sentiments. But the problem for Durkheim, I don't know that it's a problem or maybe just like a challenge. The challenge that Durkheim sees is that in modern societies, the influence of religion begins to erode. Religion becomes less influential in our modern societies, where in modern society it's more about like science and technology and money. um, it becomes about these secular things become more and more important than religion. And so it's not like religion all of a sudden goes away and evaporates, but that it begins to kind of lose influence over people's lives in modern societies. And this is generally a thing that we, are seeing to this day. And in some places, more strongly than others, say in Japan or in Western Europe, there's certainly been an erosion of the influence of religion. The United States is comparatively um, a more religious country than our similar kind or comparable kinds of you know Western European or Japanese countries or even Canada. Um, the United States has higher rates of church attendance, more people that they say that they uh, believe in God and practice their religion and so forth. But even here in the United States, that is in decline. Religiosity. It's always been very strong here, but yet it has eroded. And here is a thing where Marx and Durkheim kind of agree about modern society, is that modern society is one where, as Marx said, all that is solid melts into air and all that is holy is profaned, where the traditions of the past lose their influence, in other words, and the things that were considered sacred or holy become profaned, especially when they have a dollar sign attached to them. So for Durkheim, the big question of the modern world is like, what's going to hold us together? What are going to be the new sources of ritual and social solidarity that like replace religion or at least like supplement religion? So it's like religion doesn't have to be the source of ritual and social solidarity. It's just that that's the way traditionally it's been, right? Like historically, like religion has been the thing that has supplied social solidarity and these kind of rituals. Um, but it could be something else. it could be, nationalism, like nationalistic parades, or, people wearing ribbons in support of soldiers, or, as we saw in COVID, people wearing ribbons in support of essential workers, right? There could be this kind of secular form of social solidarity, secular meaning non-religious. Or it could be in sports. Sports definitely brings people together in this kind of ritualized way in which they, are expressing a common sort of belief or sentiments, and in which there's a heightened sense of togetherness. Or, like music festivals, people, gathered together um, to see their favorite artists or to go to a festival or whatever, where there's that sense of like togetherness. So you don't need religion to do this. It's just that religion has been the main way, historically, traditionally, in which these kind of social bonds have been affirmed. And what Durkheim is doing is basically saying we're going to have to imagine something else. We're going to have to find other forms of doing this because the influence of religion declines in modern society. Really like this comment here, Jill, about stands. This is a term that I had heard before, but hadn't really thought about in terms of like, people kind of idolize celebrities in this way that is almost kind of religious.
Yes. Did you go down the rabbit hole of the lore of a stan?
No, I don't know where this word comes from.
It comes from Eminem, the
Okay.
rapper.
Yep.
Um, oh, he had a song called Stan, and it was a
Okay.
super fan, and it's pretty horrific what happens in the song. But the super fan writes him letters, and the letters are unheard. And once, I don't know, the guy does, he mimics things that Eminem or Slim Shady, whatever, does in his music, which I don't know if you remember the early 2000s and the things that he has said. But
Yeah.
I don't know, you just have to watch like the music video, and that's essentially where this phrase has come from. And I think the new generation has just picked it up as like a mega fan. But
Yeah.
it's pretty fascinating how it took on.
I've seen it in internet culture of people
Yeah.
saying, I stand this or I stand this
Yeah.
person.
It's just a way of saying you're a stan.
Yeah,
You're a fan.
I kind of put that
Uh-huh.
together. I didn't realize that it had this
Origin.
yeah, this origin with Eminem.
Uh-huh.
And that it seems like in Eminem's hand, it kind of had a negative connotation of somebody who was like obsessed.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And
It,
now
it
it's
has it
more
has transitioned.
so now in like internet culture today though, people use it in just a more neutral way, just like, oh,
Yeah.
I stan Beyonce.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, so this is also a kind of thing that Durkheim um he never really lived to see like celebrity culture, but this is the kind of thing like he would have anticipated was like, okay, well, like people need these kind of social bonds. They need this kind of sense of belonging to something. And so if it's not going to be like religion, then people are going to start turning to things like celebrities or sports or, whatever, because because like that's just like what people need to do. That's the social character of human existence. Is we have to have that kind of sense of belonging. And so a lot of Durkheim's work is thinking about like also what happens if people don't have that sense of unity and belonging, if they don't, have some, like higher purpose, or they don't have some sense of like fitting in somewhere. and they're just like alone and adrift, you know, then we see all kinds of like antisocial, what he calls like anomie. And today, I would say we're seeing this in this sort of epidemic of violence and shooting. You know, people getting shot by, you know, the profile is often remarkably similar. It's just like these white male loners, um, who, you know, kind of, you know, are kind of like nihilistic in the sense that they don't really believe in anything, you know, and um, they're kind of taking their sort of revenge out on the world. And in each case, whether it's, you know, you're talking about the guy that, you know, attacked the church over the weekend, or the guy that shot Charlie Kirk, or the guy that shot at the ICE agents and ended up hitting the detainees. You know, we've just the guy that tried to kill Trump. In all these cases, the profile is remarkably similar. It's just like these lonely, frustrated, angry young white guys who are, you know, like terminally online, and drawing a lot from like video games and stuff like that. And so this is the kind of thing Durkheim was afraid of. Durkheim was like, if we have modern societies where there's um, a growing individualism, but not that kind of social unity, that social togetherness, then people are going to start doing all kinds of crazy, violent, antisocial, destructive kinds of things. And so sometimes I feel like we're living in Durkheim's nightmare these days. So yeah, this just kind of states uh, the difference between like Marx and Durkheim. Durkheim did believe that sociology could help make the world better, but he didn't think that like a revolution was necessary in the same way that Marx did. Durkheim was a much more conventional person, and a more established within academia, you know, whereas Marx was always getting kicked out of different countries and, you know, threatened with prison and having his writings censored and stuff like that. Durkheim was more legitimate. And his role was basically to try to make sociology into a legitimate social science, to give it scientific status, to make it, and he was largely successful. It's the reason that, you know, 125 years later or whatever, we're in this class talking about him, is because he was able to make sociology. I mean, he wasn't the only one, but like he was a leading figure among a number of people who were trying to make sociology into a legitimate social science. So I always think that that's something that sociology students need to know. You know, like, where does this thing that you're studying come from? You know, like, how did it come to be? I always think that that's important for you to know. So this gives you a little bit here about his biographical sort of background. Um, you have to, one thing you have to kind of realize is that all French intellectuals, and to this day, um, in the French like university academic system, philosophy is kind of the central, like the nucleus of everything else. And so everybody, you know, studies philosophy, and it's really kind of important to be grounded in philosophical ideas, in a way that is just not true of the United States. I don't know, for better or for worse. Um, Philosophy is kind of the intellectual centerpiece of French university life. And so Durkheim starts off studying philosophy, um, but decides that he wants to do something that's a little more pragmatic, a little bit more democratic, like less elitist, and also something that's a little bit more like scientific. Right. So um, this is where he decides that he wants to kind of develop sociology and make it legitimate. Now, remember, I hope you remember, going back to I think like the first week of class, I had said that there had this idea of sociology had already been like floating around, especially in France, with this guy Auguste Comte and Henri de Saint-Simon, going back to the 1820s and 1830s. They had imagined sociology as a scientific study of society. Durkheim is coming around much later. Durkheim is coming around like in the 1890s, so decades later. And he's basically going to pick up the torch from Saint Simon and Comte in kind of developing sociology as a something, as a legitimate kind of field. And yeah, Jill, you also have some comments here that are spot on as far as like, as does Guadalupe, about these issues that are still social issues to this day around anti-Semitism, and around suicide, and looking at suicide as a sociological phenomenon rather than just a psychological phenomenon. This was actually very important to Durkheim in terms of establishing sociology as a science. Was he writes this book that we'll look at later called Suicide, in which he tries to understand suicide as not just something that is psychologically a problem for particular individuals, but suicide as a sociological phenomenon where, certain kinds of social conditions will cause the suicide rate to go up, or other kinds of social conditions will cause the suicide rate to go down. And in doing that, Durkheim is trying to show the value of sociology as a discipline, that sociology can help explain these kinds of problems like suicide, that it has something to say about these social issues, because they're not just like personal psychological problems with individuals. They're also phenomena in which we see like the influence of society. And we know that to be true because some societies have higher rates of suicide and other societies have lower rates of suicide. And if it was just a problem with individuals and their personal problems, we wouldn't expect to see that kind of variation. Also the suicide rate is higher at certain times and lower at other times. And if this was just a matter of personal psychological issues, we would imagine the suicide rate would just be constant over time. But it doesn't. It fluctuates and it varies. And for Durkheim, that's like the first clue that this is something that has social roots and not just individual personal roots. So stay tuned for that. I think that is also a very exciting work to study in our time, where there is so much despair and self-destruction and people feeling like lost and people feeling like they don't belong, and then it comes out in all of these violent behaviors and these self-destructive behaviors. Now, Durkheim was not a fire-breathing revolutionary, like I said, but he did cause a certain amount of controversy in his lifetime, especially in the way that he studied religion. Right, so he treated religion as what he called a social fact. In other words, he wasn't like concerned with like, oh, is this religion correct or morally superior or whatever. He wanted to know like about the conditions that created that fostered religion. Precious, did you have a question?
Um, I was just wondering, just because I don't remember. I remember studying Durkheim, but I don't remember what his whole philosophy was. But was he the one that said that religion to the person is like a way to accept death, like without, it's like we can't fathom not having nothing after this life. So we create a god or an ideology of a higher superior being in order to cope with the terms of death, if that makes sense.
I don't think that that was him.
Okay.
I think that that might be coming from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. A number of people have said this, that what we do with religion is we try to we need religion in some ways to explain the unexplainable, you know, not just death, but like, why do bad things happen to good people, and why do good things happen to bad people too, you know, like we need um, religion because life is so confusing and seemingly random and chaotic that like it's like we need a roadmap. We need some way of making sense of an existence that is sometimes really hard to explain. It's really hard to understand. And so we need like some set of beliefs that are going to keep us going. And that's really, I think, where religion is most important is when people are having hard times, and it happens to all of us at some point in the life. There's just kind of no getting around it. And so we need, a way to make sense of these things. So I, I'm not sure which person you've read in the past that put it that way. I can think of a number of intellectuals who tried to understand religion in those terms.
Yeah, I can't remember, but thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, Durkheim kind of emphasizes like the social component of it. And this is a thing you see with religion is really important too. Is like when bad things happen, people come together in community, whether it's like death or illness or, a disaster like a flood or an earthquake or something like that. Um, this is where you often see people at their best, in the way that they come together and foster a sense of solidarity and kind of put their individual self-interest or their self um, concern to the side, and it really kind of brings out the best in people in a lot of ways. That kind of social action, and that I think is Durkheim thinks that that's not necessarily like why we need religion, because I don't know that he thinks that we really totally need religion, but we need something. He's basically saying like we have to have some way of creating that kind of social togetherness. And I guess he thinks it kind of doesn't matter what it is, just as long as we have that sense of solidarity, that sense of unity, that sense of responsibility towards one another. We could be worshiping Labubus for all he cares. It doesn't matter. The important thing is the social component to it, and that's kind of like got him in trouble, because like he was looking at religion in this way that wasn't like how the church wanted him to look at it, you know. He wasn't looking at it in terms of like what's the best religion, or what's the most morally correct religion, or which religion has the best grasp on the world. He didn't look at it in those terms. He looked at it more in terms of like this as a social fact, as something that he could kind of bracket out those moralistic concerns. And also, it's important to note that he was Jewish and in a country where there's strong anti-Semitism, and where like the Catholic Church is really strong. And so Durkheim, in a lot of ways, kind of found himself persecuted for that, for treating religion in this kind of in this way, when he was, kind of like visibly marked as an outsider or a minority, because he was Jewish. So that, I think, is important to sort of bring to light with him. Um, as far as like his politics and his sort of thought, yeah, he sort of he identified with some of the goals of socialism, as it says here. He thought, like, more equality would bring a greater sense of unity. But that's not his real concern. His concern is basically like um, more with like social order and unity. Like the good society is an orderly society, and that's not necessarily one that's equal or just, right? So Marx is different in the sense that Marx is interested in a society that is equal, that is just, and where people are free. That's what Marx wants. Durkheim is more like he wants social solidarity and unity and order. And he is also more committed to this ideal of science than Marx was. He was committed to this ideal of the scientist as a neutral, objective conductor of value-free research. Whereas for someone like Marx, knowledge is always in service of a higher goal of revolution, social change. Durkheim was more like he wanted knowledge for the sake of knowledge, not like knowledge for the sake of social change. So, like, remember, Marx says, the philosophers of the world, the problem with the philosophers of the world is that they've only tried to interpret the world, when the point, in fact, isn't to change it. Durkheim doesn't believe that at all. Durkheim is not as concerned with social change in a way that creates a just and equal society. He's a more conservative thinker in that sense. Um, And so then this kind of qualifies some of this. Durkheim would have been considered like a liberal or a modernist in his time. He was disliked by a lot of people who considered themselves conservatives, especially because he, treated religion as a social fact rather than a, like a supernatural doctrine or a divine thought or something like that. Durkheim would have been, Durkheim did not want to just revive religion for the sake of reviving religion in the way that conservatives wanted to do. So conservatives at the time were those who were like opposed to social change by definition. So they like wanted to conserve, to stop change from happening. Durkheim was not opposed to change. He thought it was kind of inevitable, that some kind of social evolution was necessary, and like unstoppable, that you couldn't stop the train of progress. But he was concerned that like that train of progress was going to go out of control, and that it needed to be like steered in the right direction. That you had to have like emergency brakes on the train of progress. That had to be, that there was a real danger that the train of progress was just going to take off, and like that bus in the movie Speed, from the 90s, like, and you just weren't going to be able to stop it, and it was going to like, much like the bus in Speed does, it was just going to destroy everything in its path. I don't know how many of you remember that movie with Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock from the 90s, where the bus just goes out of control and they can't stop it. So anyway, that's kind of like where Durkheim fell in these sort of debates. Well, like, yeah, that we need progress, we need change, we need evolution, but we have to try to control it somehow. Like it's dangerous, and it can destroy everything in its path. And in order to keep it from doing that, we have to create these social bonds. We have to have individuals have to feel connected to different social groups. They have to feel this sense of connection that they did in traditional societies. Because the real danger is that individuals are just going to everybody's going to kind of just do their own thing. And everyone's going to feel, like they're just, like they don't have a connection, like they don't belong, they don't have a purpose. And if that happens, Durkheim thinks that the society's in real trouble, if we have that kind of chaos. This explains Durkheim's position around like what was the major social controversy of his time, the big political scandal, which was called the Dreyfus Affair. And it basically was, it's not really important to understand like what the Dreyfus Affair was. I mean, you can look it up on Wikipedia or something if you're really interested, but that it basically like unleashed all of this kind of anti-Semitism. And Durkheim has these really interesting comments that are quoted here in this passage, around the need for around like issues of like crime and punishment. And so what I wrote was that these reflections on anti-Semitism in France are worth considering today because they parallel so much of the discourse that we're hearing now around immigration. And we're hearing like this anti-immigrant rhetoric, not just in America. This is increasingly a worldwide phenomenon, and it's really especially rampant in Europe right now too. You know, the sort of the xenophobia of the time. And so what the Dreyfus affair did was basically it influenced Durkheim's insights into how punishment and retribution enforce moral boundaries and solidify an insider group by making a scapegoat out of an outside group. And that's what, you know, all of the anti-immigrant rhetoric that we're seeing in the world today is an attempt to do that, is kind of to rally the people within the nation, you know, into an insider group on the basis of labeling an outside group. So this is a dynamic that you see in many aspects of social life. Basically, another way of putting it is like nothing unifies like having a common enemy, right? So whether you're talking about team sports or gang warfare, or, you know, warfare of any kind, the thing that really unifies people, that gives them a sense of solidarity, is their opposition to an outside group. So sometimes this can be really, you know, kind of benign, you know, like, you know, our high school against your high school, and this sort of like, you know, rivalry that exists between two towns. And the more rivalry there is, the more that there's this sense of connection. Or, you know, like as a fan of the Los Angeles Dodgers baseball team, for example, I'm a Dodger fan. I'm always getting shit from my friends who are San Francisco Giant fans, right? These kind of like team rivalries. It gets more intense, and the stakes are like kind of life and death when you start talking about like war and nationalism and patriotism and this kind of like us against them mentality. You certainly see this too in religion, that it sort of unites by dividing, you know. And so I thought that these comments here are, what do they say, evergreen, like constantly relevant. When Durkheim says in this passage, when society undergoes suffering, it feels the need to find someone whom it can hold responsible for its sickness, on whom it can avenge its misfortunes, and those against whom public opinion already discriminates are naturally designated for this role. So when things go wrong, like when an economy is in decline and prices are really high and people are feeling stressed out about paying the rent and, you know, that sort of thing, they look to a scapegoat. They look to somebody to blame. And often the scapegoat is not the people who are actually responsible for those misfortunes. Typically, the dynamic is that it's easier to blame people who are more powerless than it is to blame those who are more powerful. So this is why throughout a variety of epochs in history, different places and times, we see immigrants being the ones who are blamed for, you know, unemployment or economic recession or high taxes or, you know, any of these kinds of things. It's sort of like easier to blame immigrants, I suppose, in the sense of like, people today talk about punching down as opposed to punching up. So it's easier to like punch down on people who are less powerful. And we see this today, not just with immigrants, but with homeless people and poor people. Sort of the efforts to criminalize poverty and homelessness that are going on in this country right now, especially in the city where I live in San Francisco. So this is Durkheim sort of giving us a kind of an evergreen insight into the dynamics of scapegoating. And it will lead to his more general insight about like crime and punishment. He'll talk about the way that crime is enforced by reinforcing moral boundaries within the society. So we'll get to that a little bit lower. So we can just kind of do, I think, like the sort of we'll go with the intellectual influences here, and then pick up next time with the theoretical orientation, and then the actual reading on the division of labor. So just in terms of then his influences. This is a very important difference between Durkheim and Max Weber, who we study later on in the semester. Durkheim's approach towards sociology, in terms of trying to make it into a legitimate scientific discipline, was to begin with society as the starting point, which is to say the unit of analysis, the thing we look at as sociologists, that we are not to understand society is not just like a collection of individuals. The society has its own laws and dynamics that, if anything, actually determine the life of individuals. That society is sort of supersedes or is greater than the individual. The society, as it says here in this passage, is made up of these social facts that are external to the individual. So these things that shape our lives, whether we like it or not, and that we don't really have like choice over. So like race and racial inequality is a social fact in America that we're all born into, no matter what side of the fence you're on. It's something that like came before us. This racially divided society, and it's something that will persist after, in all likelihood, after we're gone. It's something that we kind of inherited. It's external to the individual. We don't really have a choice. Likewise with gender and gender inequalities. These are things that precede the individual, the social facts of any given society. And it's kind of like we inherit them. They're like baggage that is passed down from one generation to the next. And this is very different from Max Weber. Max Weber, his starting point is the individual. When we get to Weber, we'll see like he wants to know, why do people take certain kinds of actions? What motivates what he calls social action? So his starting point is much different than Durkheim, in terms of like what they sought to explain and where they kind of started off. Personally, I think Durkheim's perspective is superior to Weber's in this regard. But most academic disciplines like economics and political science, the individual is their starting point, is their unit of analysis. The individual is the thing that they seek to explain. Like, why do people act the way they do? What motivates human behavior? Like behavioral psychology, it's the same kind of thing. This individual is the starting point. But in sociology, or at least in Durkheimian sociology, we have to start by looking big, by thinking big, by looking at the society as a whole, and then working more like deductively into how it shapes the lives of individuals. So that's the real key difference. In a lot of ways, it's a key difference between sociology and psychology. You know, psychology is always starting with the individual. So this kind of explains this in terms of where Durkheim got this perspective. Again, it goes back to this guy, Auguste Comte, this idea of sociology that he proposed in the 1830s. Comte was, kind of the first person to use that term, sociology. And he meant it in a way where it was like we have to look at society in the same way that like a biologist would look at a biological organism. We have to start with the whole thing. We have to start with the organism and think about the sort of demands or the dynamics of a society that are independent of the individuals who live within that society. So it's a different philosophical and scientific method. And then the second theme, which is going to be real important for next class, is this distinction between mechanical and organic solidarity. I think I'll probably make this my last point because I really want to emphasize it. And then we can pick back up here with Herbert Spencer on Wednesday. So let me introduce this because it's a very important distinction that Durkheim makes around this concept of solidarity, this very important idea. So Durkheim will talk about mechanical solidarity, and he will talk about organic solidarity. And mechanical solidarity is kind of like the form of solidarity that arises in traditional, simple societies where there's not a very complicated division of labor. The mechanical solidarity, mechanical solidarity is the kind of society or a solidarity where everybody kind of thinks alike and does the same basic things. In other words, there's not a lot of room for individuality. And this would be the kind of societies you see in small towns and rural villages and, places like where, like, everybody does the same thing in the sense that there's not much of a division of labor, like you're either a hunter or a gatherer, or, there's maybe like one of a handful of occupations that everybody participates in. And therefore everybody kind of like believes the same things. They have the same, common sentiments and beliefs. It's usually anchored around some kind of religious or at least a spiritual cosmology. Whereas what we see in modern societies is a greater division of labor. So this will be the thing that defines the difference between traditional and modern societies, is the extent to which there's a division of labor. The division of labor just means kind of like the specialization of different occupations and the specialization of different institutions. So as the division of labor becomes more complicated, people are more likely to specialize in some kind of occupation, and the institutions of society specialize in dealing with certain kinds of issues or problems or concerns within the society. Now, Durkheim's idea of organic solidarity is that if everything is going well in modern society, there will still be a sense of social solidarity. It will just take on a different form. And that different form is characterized by what he calls interdependence. So, in a condition of interdependence, it's like everybody can be doing different things, they can be specialized in different functions, and yet there's still a sense of togetherness. There's still a sense of solidarity because people realize that they are interdependent with one another. That in order for me to do my job, I need, these other people to do their jobs. I need the person who, operates BART to do their job. I need, the person who makes my morning coffee to do their job. I need the janitors to clean my office. I have to have, we are all interdependent on a number of other people uh, in order for us to be able to function. And so organic solidarity is one in which it's not defined by likeness. So mechanical solidarity is defined by likeness, by everybody doing and thinking the same thing. Organic solidarity, there's more individualism, there's more specialization, there's more kind of like everybody's doing different things, and yet we are held together by this fact of interdependence. The comparison that he makes is organic solidarity is kind of like the human body or some kind of human organism or some kind of biological organism where the human body has all of these different organs, these different that play different functions: our heart, our liver, our lungs, our eyes, our brain. All of these have a different specialized role to play within our body. But in order for the body to be healthy, all of these different functions have to kind of work together, and function in an interdependent kind of way. And so if one of them stops functioning, like if our heart stops functioning or our lungs start functioning, then the other organs start to kind of like overcompensate. And, there's the potential that the whole body will eventually, decline and die if the organs aren't doing their specialized function. So, but when it's working well, when the organism is healthy and functional, it means that all these parts of our body are kind of like working together. They're not all doing the same thing. They're performing different functions. They have a different specialization. And yet there's like this harmony. It's like, like an orchestra where there's a kind of a harmony of the different sounds and different parts and different like musical instruments. Or another example might be like a team, in which like everybody, like say, on the San Francisco 49ers has a specialized role to play on that team. They have everybody has a different function. Like a football team has a very advanced division of labor. And if things are going badly, what happens is that everybody's just kind of doing their own thing. They're just looking out for their own statistics or their own success, and they don't really care about the team. And so they're just playing like individuals for their own benefit. But if it's working well, and there's a real sense of teamwork, it means that people recognize their interdependence, that like we all kind of like make each other better. That like if you do your job well, it helps me be a better player in some kind of way, that we are all kind of connected. And that's what Durkheim means by organic solidarity. So that's kind of like organic solidarity is like the best case scenario for modern society, is that we will still have this functional organism of like team society in which everybody is contributing, even though they're contributing different kinds of things. We're all like making each other better and bringing each other up. The worst case scenario is going to be this thing he calls anomie, where basically society breaks down because individuals are all off kind of doing their own thing. And there's no sense in anomie of like social cohesion or unity. There's no sense of interdependence. It's just like everybody's competing to get their own needs met, and they just don't give a damn about their neighbor. And they don't give a damn about society in general. So they're just looking out for themselves. It's just like a condition of kind of individualistic greed, and an absence of social responsibility. So religion had been the thing that had given people a sense of like accountability to their neighbor, the whole sort of golden rule about, treat others as you would yourself be treated. But without that, what happens? What's going to prevent people from being just like, I got mine and, fuck all the rest of you? Like, what's going to prevent people from just being excessively individualistic and competitive and self-interested in a way that contributes to the destruction of the society, where there is no more kind of social fabric, where there is no more social order? This is Durkheim's nightmare scenario, in which like society essentially descends into this state of chaos. It's like everybody's like running red lights, and everybody's like stealing from each other, and everybody's cheating, and all this kind of thing, where people have lost any sense of connection to their fellow human beings. In this sense, Durkheim's worst case scenario is kind of similar to what Marx envisioned when he talked about alienation, especially that fourth dimension of alienation, where Marx thinks that people become alienated from one another. They experience their fellow human being not as someone to cooperate with and to live in community with, but rather they experience their fellow human beings as somebody to manipulate, or get over on, somebody to sort of like what can they do for me, or how can I use them to get what I want. If that becomes the prevailing attitude, then society's in real trouble. And so I kind of pose this question periodically to you of like, are we living in Durkheim's nightmare? Are we living in this kind of a society where the social fabric has been torn apart and social order has melted down? And now we're just a collection of individuals who are just trying to, compete and survive and get ours. And, we don't really have a sense of like connection to other people. So I think this is like something that we should kind of pursue and think about in terms of how Durkheim's ideas may still be relevant today, how he might have, in some ways, like kind of predicted with this concept of anomie, the circumstances that we find ourselves in today, circumstances of excessive individualism and just like social irresponsibility, where, you know, any sense of like accountability to each other has been forgotten and lost. And if that's the case, what do we have to do to get it back? You know, what do we have to do to create new social bonds and new social connections? You know, what do we have to do to remind ourselves that we live in a society? You know, that we're not just like a bunch of, you know, individuals living on islands, you know, and doing what we want and pursuing our interests. That we're kind of all in this together, and that we need each other, that we're interdependent. So Durkheim would say, you know, that this has been the function of religion for centuries, is to bring people together and remind them of our common interdependence. But if we don't have that anymore, how do we get it back? How do we get something like it back? Again, it doesn't have to be religion that does that function. It can be any number of social gatherings, institutions, you know, it can be sports, it can be music festivals, it can be nationalism. There can be all kinds of ways in which like we can discover and affirm our common connection and interdependence with each other. Unfortunately, the thing that really does that the strongest is a disaster, is some sort of natural catastrophe or some kind of trauma that brings us together, where we have to like help our neighbor, and we have to ask for help from our neighbor. But Durkheim would say like we don't have enough of that, and so we have a society of very like isolated individuals, and isolated individuals, as we've seen, you know, in this recent spate of violence, isolated individuals can be really dangerous. So I think we'll leave it at that and come back to Durkheim on Wednesday. Just make sure that you put your name in the chat so that I get you from attendance. And Paige, I'll talk with you here in a minute after everybody has logged out. Sweet. Okay. Stop the share. Okay, for the rest of you, have a lovely day. Nice to see you. And see you Wednesday. Bye.